March 1945. Silesia, Eastern Front. The Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing from the east like a steel tide, crushing everything in their path. Towns burned. Roads vanished beneath endless columns of refugees. The German army, once unstoppable, was now a shattered force retreating through mud, snow, and fear. And in the middle of that dying war stood a boy who was only 12 years old. His name was Alfred. He should have been in a classroom. He should have been worrying about school lessons, scraped knees and winter games with friends. Instead, he wore a uniform, too big for his shoulders, too heavy for his childhood. Germany in 1945 had run out of time, and men, so it began using boys. The Hitler Youth, once a nationwide youth organization filled with camping trips and patriotic songs, had transformed into something far darker. As Allied forces closed in from every direction, teenagers, and sometimes children barely in their teens, were handed weapons and told they were the last line of defense. Alfred had grown up surrounded by war propaganda, posters on every wall, speeches in every school, promises of glory, honor, sacrifice. But propaganda never showed the mud, the hunger, the sound a wounded man makes when he knows no one can reach him. By early 1945, Alfred's home region in Silesia had become a corridor of retreat. German units fell back step by step as Soviet artillery pounded towns into rubble. Civilians fled west with whatever they could carry: carts, suitcases, baby carriages loaded with blankets instead of children's toys. Somewhere in that chaos, Alfred became separated from ordinary life. Records blurred in the final months of the war. Units formed and dissolved overnight. Boys like Alfred were attached to local defense groups, retreating formations, or ad hoc units made up of stragglers and survivors. No ceremony marked his entry into combat. One day he was a boy in a collapsing homeland. The next, he was moving with soldiers. They didn't quite know what to do with him. The men he ended up beside were exhausted veterans, uniforms torn, faces hollow, eyes that had seen too much for too long. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to survive one more day, to avoid encirclement, to keep moving west. And among them walked this quiet, pale-haired child. Someone gave him a spare field cap. Another shared dry rations. A medic showed him how to drop flat when artillery shells screamed overhead. "Stay behind us," they told him. But the front lines in March 1945 did not behave like front lines anymore. They shifted by the hour. That morning began under a low grey sky. Snow clung in patches along the roadside, melting into icy sludge. The unit had paused near a shallow embankment, beside a narrow rural road. A supply cart stood nearby, its horse trembling from exhaustion. The men were trying to move wounded and equipment before Soviet forces cut the route off completely. Then came the gunfire. Sudden, close, violent. Machine gun bursts tore through the trees ahead, sending splinters raining down. Soldiers dove into the ditch. Someone shouted for cover. The horse screamed, a terrible human-like sound, and collapsed in its harness. When the firing paused, the silence that followed was worse, because it wasn't quiet. It was filled with cries for help. Several German soldiers had been caught in the open stretch of road ahead when the shooting began. They lay exposed now, some dragging themselves inches at a time, others completely still except for weak movements of their arms. Anyone who tried to reach them would be visible to enemy gunners. The men in the ditch knew it. They also knew what leaving wounded behind meant. Alfred saw the hesitation on their faces. These were grown men who had survived years of war, men who had charged across battlefields and endured bombardments that shook the earth. But now they were pinned by a hidden enemy, forced to watch their comrades suffer in the open. A small handcart sat near the ditch, meant for hauling supplies. Alfred looked at it, then at the road, then at the wounded men. He did not think in terms of tactics or survival probabilities. He thought, they need help. Before anyone understood what he was doing, the boy grabbed the cart's handles and pulled it onto the road. "Stop!" a soldier hissed. "Get back here!" but Alfred was already moving forward. Each step felt like walking into a storm. His boots slipped in the mud. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out the world. Every second he expected to feel the impact of a bullet. The first wounded soldier he reached was clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. The man stared up at him in disbelief. "You're just a kid," he whispered. Alfred didn't answer. He hooked his arms under the man's shoulders and dragged him onto the cart. It took everything he had. The soldier groaned in pain, biting back a scream. Then Alfred turned and pushed. The cart's bent wheel wobbled, but it rolled. From the ditch, soldiers watched in frozen horror. Gunfire cracked again. Bullets struck the road nearby, kicking up dirt and ice. Alfred flinched, but kept going, head down, legs shaking with effort. Hands reached out from the ditch and pulled the wounded man to safety. Alfred didn't stay. He turned around and went back. He ran back onto the road a second time. The air felt thinner now, louder. Every sound sharpened. The crack of rifles, the distant thud of artillery, the rasp of his own breath. Smoke drifted from somewhere beyond the tree line, carrying the bitter scent of burning wood and cordite. Another soldier lay face down in the slush, one leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Alfred reached him and turned him over. The man's eyes were open, glassy with shock. Blood soaked the front of his coat. He tried to speak, but only a wet cough came out. "It's all right," Alfred said, though his voice trembled. "I've got you." He didn't know if the soldier heard him. Getting the man onto the cart was harder this time. The wounded soldier was heavier, limp, his gear snagging on the wooden frame. Alfred pulled and pushed, slipping, hands burning with cold and effort. Gunfire snapped again. A bullet punched into the cart's side, splintering wood inches from his hand. He froze for half a second, then kept moving. The cart rattled as he shoved it back toward the ditch. Boots sliding, lungs burning. Soldiers reached out again, dragging the wounded man down into cover. Someone grabbed Alfred by the collar. "You little fool!" a corporal shouted, half furious, half shaking with relief. "You want to get yourself killed." Alfred pulled free. "There are more," he said. He went back a third time. By now, the enemy gunners had realized what was happening. Shots came quicker, stitching the road with dirt. Alfred felt fragments hit his coat, tiny stings like wasps. He kept low, pushing the empty cart ahead like a shield. The third soldier was conscious, but trapped under the body of another man who had already stopped moving. It took Alfred several tries to pull the living one free. The wounded soldier cried out, clutching at the boy's sleeve like a drowning man, grabbing driftwood. "You shouldn't be here," he gasped. But he held on. Alfred dragged him onto the cart and pushed again, muscles screaming, his vision blurred with tears from the cold wind and smoke. By the time he reached the ditch, his arms felt like they belonged to someone else. That should have been enough. It wasn't. He went back again and again. Each time the road felt longer. Each time the gunfire seemed closer. Once he stumbled and fell to his knees, hands sinking into icy mud. He thought for a moment he wouldn't get up. Then he heard another voice, calling weakly from the road. So he stood. By the time the shooting eased and Soviet troops shifted their fire elsewhere, Alfred had helped pull a dozen wounded men off that road. 12. Some could still speak. Some drifted in and out of consciousness. A few would not survive the day despite everything. But they had not died alone in the open. When it was finally quiet, one of the soldiers pulled Alfred down into the ditch and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. The man was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears cutting tracks through grime on a face that had forgotten how to feel anything but exhaustion. "You saved us," he said. Alfred didn't know what to say to that. He was shaking now that it was over, not from cold, but from the release of fear his body had held back. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He looked down at them, confused. He hadn't felt brave. He had felt terrified every second. Later that day, Word of what he had done spread through the scattered unit. In the final months of the war, stories traveled fast, especially ones that could be used. An officer arrived 2 days later. His uniform was cleaner than the others. His tone rehearsed. He asked Alfred to stand straight, to repeat his name clearly. Questions were asked. Numbers were counted. 12 wounded soldiers rescued under enemy fire, the officer said, writing it down as if recording inventory. Alfred stood stiffly, unsure where to look. Within a week, photographers appeared. They posed him beside older soldiers, adjusted his cap, told him not to smile. Flash. Another angle. Flash. The story was too perfect for a collapsing regime to ignore. A boy, loyal, fearless, sacrificing himself for the fatherland. Newspapers ran the image. Commanders repeated the tale. It became proof, at least in propaganda, that Germany's youth still burned with unbreakable spirit. Then came the ceremony. It took place in a half-damaged town hall, far behind the shifting front. Windows were boarded, plaster flaked from the ceiling, but a flag had been hung carefully to frame the moment. Alfred stood on a small platform, boots polished for the first time in weeks. An officer pinned a medal to his chest, the Iron Cross, second class, metal cold against thin fabric. Someone read a citation about courage under fire, about loyalty, about heroic youth. Applause echoed weakly in the room. Alfred stared straight ahead, trying to understand how pulling men on a cart had turned into this. He did not feel like a hero. He felt tired, hungry, and suddenly very small inside, a uniform that still didn't quite fit. The medal hung heavy on his chest as the war outside continued to collapse. Within weeks, Soviet forces would overrun the region entirely. The propaganda would stop. The cameras would disappear. And the boy they had called a symbol of heroic Germany would face a very different future. Because medals did not stop bullets, and childhood, once traded for war, did not simply come back when the fighting moved on. Soon, Alfred would be handed a weapon for real, and the next time he ran into gunfire, he would not walk away unhurt. The front collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Orders came in fragments. Units dissolved. Officers disappeared overnight, either reassigned, captured, or simply gone. What had once been lines on a map were now just roads filled with refugees, retreating soldiers, and abandoned vehicles. Alfred was still 12. The medal was still pinned inside his tunic, wrapped in cloth now so it wouldn't clink or draw attention. It no longer felt like an honor. It felt like something dangerous to be caught with, depending on who stopped you. Well, there was no ceremony when they handed him a rifle, no speech, no photographer, just a tired sergeant pressing the weapon into his hands and pointing toward a tree line where Soviet troops had been reported moving through the forest. "Stay with the others," the man said, "and don't waste ammunition." The rifle felt heavier than the cart had. Alfred had trained with wooden replicas before, fired a few real rounds on a range behind the lines. But this was different. This time, the targets would shoot back. He lay in a shallow scrape in the earth, beside 3 older boys and a man old enough to be his father. No one talked much. The air was full of the distant rumble of artillery and the closer, more terrifying silence in between. He kept thinking about the soldiers he had pulled from the road. He wondered if any of them were still alive. He wondered if they would recognize him now, lying in the mud with a rifle instead of a cart. Branches snapped somewhere ahead. The man to Alfred's left stiffened, raised his weapon. A shape moved between the trees. Then another. Shouting erupted, not in German. Gunfire exploded down the line. Alfred flinched so hard he nearly dropped the rifle. Dirt kicked into his face as bullets struck the ground nearby. The man beside him fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder again and again. "Shoot!" someone screamed. Alfred lifted the rifle. His hands shook so badly he could barely see down the sights. He squeezed the trigger because everyone else was shooting, because not shooting felt like standing up in a storm and asking to be struck. The recoil shocked him. He didn't know if he hit anything. The forest filled with noise, splintering wood, shouted orders, the strange, terrifying whine of rounds passing too close. A boy 2 positions down cried out and clutched his arm, blood already soaking his sleeve. "Medic!" he screamed, over and over, though there was no medic left. The line didn't hold long. It couldn't. Soviet troops were better equipped, better supplied, and no longer willing to be slowed by children with rifles. A grenade landed somewhere to Alfred's right. The blast threw dirt and debris into the air, and when his ears stopped ringing, the man who had been firing beside him wasn't moving. Someone yelled to fall back. Alfred didn't remember standing, didn't remember deciding to run. He just ran. Branches whipped his face. His breath tore in and out of his lungs. Behind him, gunfire followed like a pack of hunting dogs. Then something hit him. A hammer blow to his back. His legs folded. The rifle flew from his hands as he pitched forward into the cold earth. For a moment, he didn't feel pain, only confusion. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out. The sky above him looked strangely bright between the treetops. He heard shouting, "Closer now," in Russian. Boots thudded past him. Someone rolled him over with a rough hand. A face loomed above, young, exhausted, smeared with dirt just like his own. The Soviet soldier stared at him, at the too small uniform, at the smooth, terrified face. He said something Alfred didn't understand. Another soldier knelt and pulled open the back of Alfred's coat, hands pressed against the wound. Pain finally arrived, white-hot and blinding. Alfred screamed, a high, broken sound he didn't recognize as his own. "Rebianok," one of the men muttered. "Child." They didn't shoot him. They bandaged him roughly, field dressing tight across his back, then dragged him onto a stretcher already stained with someone else's blood. The war he had been told to fight for ended for him on that forest floor, not with victory, not with glory, but staring up at foreign faces, realizing he was no longer a soldier in an army. He was a wounded prisoner. The journey east blurred into fever and fragments. Train cars that smelled of rust and sickness. Groans in the dark. Snow seen through cracks in wooden slats. Sometimes he drifted awake long enough to taste watery soup pressed to his lips. Other times he vanished into dreams, where he was back on that road, with the cart running toward men he could still save. When the fever finally broke, he was in a camp, barbed wire, watchtowers, rows of low wooden barracks, sunk into mud. There were grown men everywhere, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wrapped in worn coats that hung off them like blankets on fence posts. Conversations stopped when they saw him. A boy with a bandaged back. Someone gave him a place on a bunk near a stove that barely worked. An older prisoner, a former schoolteacher, shared his bread without being asked. "No one is a hero here," the man said quietly when he noticed the iron cross Alfred still carried on a string under his shirt. "Only survivors." Days turned into a rhythm of hunger, roll calls, and work details when he was strong enough to stand. The wound healed slowly, leaving a tight, aching scar that pulled whenever he moved too quickly. No one cared about medals. No one cared about propaganda stories from a country that no longer existed in the way they had known it. The guards cared about quotas, about order, about getting through another winter. At night, men talked in low voices about home, about farms and factories, wives and mothers who might not even know they were still alive. Alfred listened. He didn't talk much about the road, or the ceremony, or the medal. Those things felt like they had happened to a different person. Someone older. Someone braver. Someone who had believed the war meant something. In the camp, he learned a different kind of courage. How to share food when you were starving. How to stand in line for hours without collapsing. How to keep a small, stubborn piece of yourself, untouched by barbed wire and loss. Years would pass before he saw Germany again. By then, the Reich that had handed a child a medal and a rifle would be rubble and memory. But the weight of those days, the road, the cart, the forest, the shot in the back, would follow him long after the fences were gone, because history would remember him as a symbol, a youngest hero. But inside, he would always remember something simpler, a scared 12-year-old boy who just didn't want to leave wounded men alone on a road. Years later, when people asked about the medal, Alfred would pause for a long time before answering. Not because he didn't remember, but because he remembered too clearly. The camp in the Soviet Union became the place where his childhood finally ended, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in the slow, grinding routine of captivity. Winter was the hardest. Cold crept into everything, through boots with holes in the soles, through blankets too thin to matter. Ice formed on the inside of the barrack walls, delicate and beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Men woke with frost in their hair and breath that hung in the air like smoke from dying fires. Alfred was one of the youngest in the camp. At first, the older prisoners tried to shield him from the worst jobs. They swapped work assignments when they could, gave him the spot closest to the stove, slipped him bits of potato from their own rations, not out of pity alone, but because he reminded them of sons they hadn't seen in years. But mercy had limits in a place built on scarcity. Soon he was hauling timber, digging frozen earth, carrying loads that made his half-healed back burn like fire. He learned not to cry out when the pain spiked. Weakness drew attention, and attention brought trouble. The guards were not monsters from propaganda posters. Most were tired, underfed, and far from home themselves. Some were brutal. Some were indifferent. A few, rarely, showed flashes of humanity, so small they almost hurt more than cruelty. One guard once slipped him an extra ladle of soup when he saw Alfred struggling to stand during roll call. Another struck him across the shoulders with a rifle butt for not moving fast enough. War had flattened everyone into roles they never would have chosen. At night, stories traveled from bunk to bunk. One man had been a baker in Hamburg, another a tram driver in Berlin. A third had studied engineering before being drafted in 1944. They spoke of streets and seasons, of the smell of fresh bread, of the sound of church bells on quiet mornings. Alfred had fewer memories to offer. His stories were mostly from the Hitler youth camps, hikes, drills, songs around fires, the sense of belonging that had once felt warm and exciting. Now, in the half-dark of the barracks, those memories felt like scenes from a play performed by children who didn't understand the ending. One evening, the former schoolteacher, who had first shared his bread, asked him quietly, "Do you still believe what they told you?" Alfred didn't answer right away. He thought of the road, of the wounded men calling for help, of the medal pinned to his chest by smiling officers, of the forest, the gunfire, the shot in his back, of the Soviet soldier who had called him a child instead of finishing him with a bullet. "I believed I should help them," Alfred said at last. "The wounded. That part was real." The teacher nodded. "Helping someone in pain is not ideology," he said. "That belongs to you, not to them." It was the first time Alfred began to separate what he had done from the machine that had used it. Seasons turned. The war ended, though news reached the camp slowly and in fragments. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. Cities were in ruins. Millions were displaced. Some men wept when they heard. Some stared at the ground, silent. Alfred felt mostly numb. The world that had shaped him had collapsed while he stood behind barbed wire. Too young to vote. Too young to drive, but old enough to carry scars that would never fully fade. Repatriation did not happen quickly. There were lists, transports, delays. Years stretched on. Alfred grew taller. His voice deepened. The roundness of childhood disappeared from his face. The Iron Cross, which he had once hidden, was eventually traded for extra food during a desperate winter. He watched it change hands without ceremony, surprised by how little he felt as it left him. The medal had never been the thing that mattered. When he was finally put on a train heading west, He was no longer the boy who had run with a cart under artillery fire. He was a young man with a stiff back, hollowed memories, and a quietness that would follow him for the rest of his life. Germany in the late 1940s was a landscape of rubble and rebuilding. Cities were broken teeth against the sky. Families searched for missing names. Former soldiers came home to streets that no longer looked like the ones in their dreams. Alfred returned to a place that had no use for child heroes anymore. People were tired of uniforms, tired of slogans, tired of stories that had been used to send boys to die. Survival, food, shelter. These were the only victories that mattered now. He did not speak much about the war. When he did, he talked about the wounded men on the road. Not the medal. About the cold in the camp, not the speeches. About the moment a stranger in an enemy uniform had chosen to bandage a child instead of shooting him. As the years passed, historians and journalists would sometimes rediscover his story. The youngest recipient of the Iron Cross, they would say. A symbol of the desperation of the final days of the Reich. They were not wrong, but they never quite captured the truth that lived inside him. That he had been a boy who wanted to prove he was brave. A boy who had been told that bravery meant obedience. A boy who learned too late and at great cost that real courage often looks quieter, like pulling a stranger out of the mud, or sharing bread in a freezing barrack, or choosing not to hate the people who once wore a different uniform. In old age, when his hands trembled and his back ached with the ghost of an old bullet wound, Alfred would sometimes sit by a window and watch children playing in the street. Their laughter carried on the air, careless and bright. He never envied their future. He only hoped they would never be handed a medal for surviving a world that had lost its mind. In the decades that followed, the world tried to make sense of stories like Alfred's by turning them into symbols. Textbooks used words like fanaticism, collapse, total war. Documentaries showed grainy footage of boys in oversized uniforms, clutching rifles almost as tall as they were. Historians spoke about the last months of the Third Reich as a time when childhood itself was drafted, armed, and sent to the front. All of that was true, and yet none of it captured the small human details Alfred carried quietly for the rest of his life. The smell of damp wool, the weight of wet boots, the way fear didn't always feel sharp and dramatic. Sometimes it was just a dull, constant pressure behind the ribs, like a stone you couldn't cough up. He built a life the way many in his generation did, slowly, without drawing attention to the cracks. There was work first, hard, practical work, clearing debris, repairing rail lines, carrying bricks to construction sites where new walls rose from the skeletons of old ones. His back never fully healed, but he learned which movements to avoid, how to lift with his legs, how to ignore the ache when the weather turned cold. Later, there was a small apartment, plain furniture, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, the quiet dignity of ordinary routines, coffee in the morning, bread in the evening, the radio murmuring news from a world that seemed determined to race forward without looking back. He married. Not a dramatic romance, not a sweeping story, just two people who had both seen too much, finding comfort in the steadiness of each other's presence. His wife knew he had been a soldier as a boy. Almost everyone of his age had some version of that story. But she also knew when not to ask questions. Silences in their home were not empty. They were respectful. Sometimes, on certain nights, Alfred would wake suddenly, heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. In his dreams, he was back on the forest road, pulling the cart, shells falling closer, closer. Or he was in the camp again, counting footsteps in the snow, afraid to stumble. He never shouted. He never thrashed. He would just sit on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, waiting for the room to become a room again instead of a memory. His wife would place a hand on his back, gently, always gently, mindful of the old wound. And that simple touch anchored him to the present more effectively than any words could. As West Germany rebuilt and reinvented itself, public conversation about the war shifted. In the early years, People focused on survival and reconstruction. Later came the harder questions: responsibility, guilt, complicity. How an entire society had been pulled into something so catastrophic. Alfred followed these debates quietly, often with a tightness in his chest he couldn't quite name. He had been 12, old enough to carry ammunition, old enough to drag wounded men from a road under fire, old enough to be given a medal and a rifle. But not old enough, he would later think, to understand the machine he had been inside. When younger generations began to ask their parents and grandparents, "What did you do during the war?" many former soldiers struggled to answer. Alfred's answer, when it came, was always the same. "I was a child," he would say first, not as an excuse, as a fact. Then, if the listener stayed, if they seemed to want understanding rather than judgment or glorification, he would tell them about the road, the wounded men, the cart with the broken wheel that kept catching on stones. He would describe the fear, yes, but also the stubborn, almost irrational need to help. "I didn't think about Germany," he would say. "I thought about the man in front of me who couldn't stand up." That distinction mattered to him more than any medal ever had. In schools, when he was occasionally invited to speak late in life, he did not wear decorations. He did not bring photographs of himself in uniform. He stood in plain clothes, an old man with careful posture and a soft voice, and told students something many of them had never heard from a wartime story. He told them that war shrinks the world. "It makes everything very small," he said once to a classroom so quiet you could hear the lights humming overhead. "Small choices, small fears, small acts of kindness that feel enormous because everything else is so dark." A student asked him if he was proud of what he had done. He took a long time to answer. "I am glad those men lived a little longer," he said at last. "I am not glad there was a war where a child had to do that." As he aged, journalists occasionally returned to the old headline, "The youngest Iron Cross recipient." Some wanted a dramatic quote, a heroic angle, a tragic one, something that would fit neatly into a paragraph or a caption. Alfred disappointed them. He refused to curse the boy he had been, but he also refused to let anyone turn that boy into a poster. "I was not a hero," he said, more than once. "I was a child in a country that had run out of adults willing to say no." In the end, what stayed with him most was not the medal ceremony, not even the gunshot that had nearly killed him. It was the faces, the wounded soldier gripping his sleeve, whispering thanks through cracked lips, the Soviet medic who had looked at him, really looked at him, and chosen mercy over vengeance, the school teacher in the camp barracks, dividing a crust of bread into 2 equal pieces. Proof, scattered across the worst of times, that humanity did not vanish completely. It just became harder to find. Near the end of his life, when his world had grown small again, a chair by the window, a blanket over his knees, the slow rhythm of days, Alfred sometimes watched children walking home from school, backpacks bouncing, laughter spilling down the street, arguments about games, about homework, about things that would be forgotten by dinner. He never wished to go back and change his past. He knew history didn't bend that way. But he held one quiet hope, simple and fierce, that those children would grow up in a world where bravery meant building things, not surviving the ruins left behind by grown men's madness. Years passed in that quiet rhythm, and the world outside Alfred's window kept changing in ways his 12-year-old self could never have imagined. Borders opened, walls fell. Countries that had once tried to annihilate each other now traded goods, students, and ideas. Young people traveled across Europe with backpacks and train passes, crossing frontiers that in his childhood had been marked by barbed wire and artillery. Sometimes he watched the news and felt as if he were looking at a miracle so ordinary that people no longer recognized it as one. Peace, he thought, was the strangest miracle of all. Not loud, not dramatic, just the absence of explosions, the quiet expectation that tomorrow would probably look a lot like today. He never stopped feeling grateful for that. In his later years, letters began to arrive. Some were from historians asking for clarification about dates units, locations. They wanted to pin his memory to maps and archives, to fit it into the larger puzzle of a collapsing front in 1945. Others came from strangers, a teacher who had shown his story to a class, a grandson of a German soldier who wondered if Alfred might have been the boy who saved his grandfather, a woman from Poland who wrote gently and bravely about her own family's suffering under German occupation, and said she was trying to understand how children on the other side had also been trapped by the same regime. Those letters meant more to him than any official recognition ever had, because they were not about medals, they were about understanding. When he answered, his handwriting slow and careful, he never defended the war, never excused the system that had put a rifle in his hands. But he also refused to erase the boy he had been. "I carry both things," he wrote once. "The shame of what my country did, and the memory that, in one moment, I tried to save lives instead of take them." That balance was uncomfortable, complicated, human. As his strength faded, his world narrowed to a few rooms, a few familiar voices, a few routines that gave shape to the day. Nurses came and went. Family visited. Old photographs were sorted into envelopes, names written on the back so they would not be lost when the people who remembered them were gone. There was one photograph he kept on his bedside table, not of the war, not of the medal ceremony. It was a simple picture taken decades later. Alfred, middle-aged, standing beside a newly planted tree with a shovel in his hand. A small plaque at the base marked a community park rebuilt on land that had once been rubble. Whenever someone asked about it, he would smile faintly. "Planting is better than fighting," he would say. In the end, when his life drew to a close, there was no grand speech, no dramatic final confession, just quiet breaths, a hand held, the soft beeping of hospital machines that sounded, in a distant way, like the ticking of a clock, finally allowed to slow down. The boy who had run through artillery fire with a wooden cart, the teenager who had lain bleeding in the mud, the prisoner who had stared at snow through barbed wire, the man who had spent a lifetime trying to live gently in a world he had first met through violence, all of them were the same person. And his story, like so many from that generation, did not end with a medal or a wound. It ended with a question left behind for those who came after. What do we do with the lives we are given, especially when history tries to turn us into something we never chose to be? Alfred's answer, imperfect and quiet, had been this: save who you can, refuse to forget. And when the guns finally fall silent, choose every day after to build instead of destroy. And that's where we'll leave this story. History isn't just about battles and generals. It's about people, choices, and moments that changed lives forever. If this story made you think, let us know in the comments. We read every one. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to WW2 Studio for more powerful, untold stories from the Second World War. Until next time, remember the human side of history.